Vielen Dank, Eva Grubinger. Ich freue mich jetzt, Ihnen Vivian Rehberg vorstellen zu dürfen. Sie ist Kunsthistorikerin und Kritikerin aus Paris. Sie gründete das Journal of Visual Culture und publiziert regelmäßig in den Magazinen Frieze, Art in America oder Artforum. Und ihr heutiger Vortrag trägt den Titel Why Baudelaire Was Wrong About Sculpture. Bitte schön.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Is that too loud? No? It's okay. I hear an echo. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for coming. The title of my talk was Why Baudelaire Was Wrong About Sculpture, and I'm not quite sure what the title of my talk is now, but I won't be speaking about Baudelaire. As the title and description of the symposium attest, it's difficult to address the contemporary viability of sculpture. Sorry, I just need to make an adjustment with this so I can have easy access to... Because what I would rather do actually is use this. Okay. Yeah, but then I have to reach. Okay. Can we just move? Sorry. I'll start again. 1 second. Terrific, thank you. Okay. Okay, now I'm ready. As the title and description of the symposium attest, it's difficult to address the contemporary viability of sculpture as an artistic medium without taking into account the foremost narrative of its expansion. Sculpture has long ceased to adhere to its limits as a materially bounded, self-sufficient, three-dimensional form of representation with its own set of conventions and structural coherence. Instead, to cite Rosalind Krauss's remarkable 1978 essay, sculpture is seen to operate within an expanded field. Krauss's account of sculpture's shift of focus from medium, or the material and technical supports for artistic practice, to field, which, quote, provides both for a finite set of related positions for a given artist to explore and occupy, and for an organization of work that is not dictated by the particular conditions of a medium, has influenced Anglophone art historical and critical writing about sculpture since it was first published in October magazine in 1979. To summarize briefly, Krauss outlines in that text how artistic movements from modernism to minimalism, from land art to site-specific art, conceptualism and post-minimalism, had successfully undermined, essentially negated, the reliability of the traditional terms we associate with sculpture: monument, pedestal, site, architecture, space, ornament, and public. She charts what she calls a waning of the logic of the monument, its lapsing into obsolescence, and the subsequent reduction and expansion of the medium and materials of sculpture from the late 19th century with Rodin to the 1960s and 1970s. Once a statue on a pedestal that physically and symbolically marked a location with a realistic, abstract, or allegorical figure, sculpture became, in the hands of the modernists and minimalists, an object that stressed its physical autonomy, favored basic geometric shapes, and the inherent properties of industrial materials, up until still other artists abandoned the creation of material objects as such, began intervening directly into natural or built environments, combining different media in their practice and critiquing institutions in such a way to dislodge the historical category known as sculpture from its privileged place. This expanded field emerged as a symptom of the loss of the aesthetic and historical bearings that accompanied the transition from modernism to postmodernism. Over the last 10 years, rather surprising things have come to be called sculpture. Narrow corridors with TV monitors at the ends, large photographs documenting hikes, country hikes, mirrors placed at strange angles in ordinary rooms, temporary lines cut into the floor of the desert. Nothing, it would seem, could possibly give to such a motley of effort the right to lay claim to whatever one might mean by the category of sculpture, unless, that is, the category can be made to become almost infinitely malleable. The story Krauss tells is one in which artists develop a language of sculpture via a series of negations, by opposing sculpture to what it is not or what it should no longer be, and by constantly renegotiating sculpture's relationship of dependence to natural or architectural sites and institutional frameworks, which Krauss holds onto the institutional framework as sculpture's conditions of possibility. Krauss mainly objects to the idea of a medium having infinite possibilities. She wants to demonstrate that what was available to sculpture at that time was, quote, only a function of the history and structural logic of a given form. She explains, "We had thought to use a universal category to authenticate a group of particulars, but the category has now been forced to cover such a heterogeneity that it is itself in danger of collapsing. And so we stare at the pit in the earth and we think we both do and don't know what sculpture is. Yet I would submit that we know very well what sculpture is, and one of the things we know is that it is a historically bound category and not a universal one. As is true of any other convention, sculpture has its own internal logic, its own set of rules, which, though they can be applied to a variety of situations, are not themselves open to very much change." Her objection is not strictly formal, it's also ideological. Sculpture in the expanded field is as much about the possibilities for locating and maintaining a poised critical voice to avoid shouting in the wilderness, as it is about three-dimensional objects called sculpture. Krauss laments the incapacity or unwillingness of her fellow American art critics to analyze the historical processes that have led to sculpture acquiring such infinite malleability, while attacking their penchant for constructing elaborate genealogical trees. In the hands of this criticism, categories like sculpture and painting have been kneaded and stretched and twisted in an extraordinary demonstration of elasticity, a display of the way a cultural term can be extended to include just about anything. And though this pulling and stretching of a term, such as sculpture, is overtly performed in the name of vanguard aesthetics, the ideology of the new, its covert message is that of historicism. The new is made comfortable by being made familiar, since it is seen as having gradually evolved from the forms of the past. Historicism works the new and different to diminish newness and mitigate difference. And my difference has migrated on this slide. I don't want to toil for too much longer over the art historical ground of this particular description of the expanded field of sculpture, merely to remind us that historical contingency and medium specificity are two concepts that are tightly bound up with one another in this original text, and that they remain relevant for discussions in art theory and practice today. They are also the foundation for Krauss's later formulation of the post-medium condition, which she diagnosed as one where artists forsake the retention and use of specific mediums and instead pursue the interaction between them. That Krauss is hostile to this interaction is an understatement. She recently declared that it is her conviction that the abandonment of the specific medium spells the death of serious art, and it's called the post-medium condition, which she further characterizes as a jettisoning of aesthetic coherence and specificity, a monstrous myth. She advocates a reinvention of the medium in order to reclaim, quote, the specific from the deadening embrace of the general, end quote, and to recuperate a kind of autonomy that grows from an intimate understanding and a mining of a specific medium's own potential for self-differentiation, its own plurality, which can be located, according to her, in its internal logic. Here she is in 1999, and here I finish citing Krauss, explaining what she means by a reinvention of the medium. And she does this via an analysis of slide works by James Coleman, which I won't touch on at all today. Krauss writes, "The medium in question here is not any of the traditional media, painting, sculpture, drawing, architecture that include photography." So photography with respect to the use of the slide. So the reinvention in question does not imply the restoration of any one of those earlier forms of support that the age of mechanical reproduction had rendered thoroughly dysfunctional through their own assimilation to the commodity form. Rather, it concerns the idea of a medium as such, a medium as a set of conventions derived from but not identical with, and that's where she tries to distinguish herself from Clement Greenberg and his theory of flatness, but not identical with the material conditions of a given technical support, conventions out of which to develop a form of expressiveness that can be both projective and mnemonic. Artistically, our present moment is as much, if not more than it was in the late 1970s, a moment in which a diverse array of media technologies and approaches to them cohabit in the practice of single artists, single works, and under the guise of a single medium, with dance and performance, film and video, painted assemblage, installation, all able to be grouped under the heading of sculpture or to be seen as operating in the service of sculpture. In the face of this heterogeneity, where, as our organizers suggest, and as Ava's slide presentation just showed, practically anything can be construed as sculpture, it might be worth asking what it would mean for sculpture to develop such a form of expressiveness that can be both projective or future-oriented and mnemonic, imbued with memory and the commemorative of sculpture, or at least of an idea of sculpture. At the same time, it's equally worth questioning the ongoing validity of a theory that puts such emphasis on the essential nature of the materials and medium of sculpture without wanting to recuperate its traditions, when that theory is time and again challenged, if not fully destabilized, by the proliferation of works that call themselves sculpture or rely on sculptural processes, but are not made manifest with materials or traditions of sculpture. Does a historical and critical account of sculptural development like Krauss's open up, or rather foreclose, our experience of contemporary art that engages with the sculptural? I don't share Krauss's structuralist mindset or her passion for charts, and I certainly don't want to claim that we should map current art practice formulaically onto the Klein diagram that Krauss so eloquently delimits and that Sam Durant cheekily parodies in his expanded field of commercial and artistic culture in quaternary field alternative diagram. I'd like to retain something of her conviction, though, that sculpture is a historically bound category rather than a universal one, and consider, through a very quick excursion through several examples, some of the ways that historically bound category has staged and continues to stage its encounter with another historically bound category, that of film. By 1970, almost a decade prior to the publication of Krauss's essay, the notion of an expanded media in film had surfaced via experiments with the technical and material components of film, the camera, the projector, the celluloid strip, the screen, and adjustments to the environments within which films were being shown. The place of film theorist Sheldon Reenan's study of American underground film and Gene Youngblood's book, Expanded Cinema, in the genealogy of an expanded notion of media has been foregrounded by very few art historians writing on sculpture in the 1960s and 70s, with the exception of Anne Wagner. Whereas Krauss formulates the expansion of sculpture structurally, Youngblood decisively associates the inexorable expansion of media with an expansion of consciousness. And I have a long quote, which unfortunately I didn't remember to put in the PowerPoint, so I will read it slowly. This is Youngblood. We're in transition from the industrial age to the cybernetic age, characterized by many as the post-industrial age. But I found the term paleo-cybernetic valuable as a conceptual tool with which to grasp the significance of our present environment, combining the primitive potential associated with Paleolithic and the transcendental integrities of practical utopianism associated with cybernetic. So I call it the Paleo-Cybernetic Age, an image of a hairy, buck-skinned, barefooted atomic physicist with a brain full of mescaline and algorithms, working out the heuristics of computer-generated holograms or krypton laser interferometry. It's the dawn of man. For the first time in history, we'll soon be free enough to discover who we are. When we say expanded cinema, we actually mean expanded consciousness. Expanded cinema does not mean computer films, video phosphors, atomic light, or spherical projections, so it's not dependent at all on the material components of cinema, in other words. Expanded cinema isn't a movie at all. Like life, it's a process of becoming, man's ongoing historical drive to manifest his consciousness outside his mind, in front of his eyes. one no longer can specialize in a single discipline and hope truthfully to express a clear picture of its relationships in the environment. And in parallel, it's clear for some artists it no longer made sense for them to specialize in a single medium and hope truthfully to express a clear picture of its relationship to the environment. Whereas Youngblood emphasizes the social, psychological, and experiential aspects of viewers' encounter with cinema, Krauss shunts bodies and minds off the page entirely beyond the periphery where sculpture as such has been exiled. Youngblood's understanding of expansion means one no longer can specialize in a single discipline and hope truthfully to express a clear picture of its relationship in the environment, while Krauss would argue soon after that it is only through the specialization in a single medium that truth can be revealed. In the late 1960s, though, Sheldon Reenan argued persuasively that the medium of film is no longer necessary to produce the effects of film. Around that time, artists were also questioning how necessary the medium of sculpture was to producing the effects of sculpture, effects that in their most fundamental sense involve bodies in space interacting with primarily three-dimensional manufactured things placed in that space with them. Within the visual art context, there are too many examples intersecting with expanded cinema to mention here, but the one with which we are probably most familiar is Anthony McCall's line describing a cone from 1973. McCall rejected the image on the film strip, sound, and the screen as mediators of the film experience and focused instead on the misty beam of light produced by the projector. His process neutralized the authorial voice of narrative cinema and augmented sculptural values like volume, the occupation of space, and the corporeal interaction of spectators with the materialized light and with each other in that space. I guess you can't really see, there's some figures in there. And while his light works were temporary in a way that a monumental public sculpture might not be, they employed duration, line describing a cone operated for 30 minutes, while others, like long film for 4 projectors, lasted for over 5 hours. McCall described his intention as follows. This three-dimensional object, like sculpture, calls for a mobile, participating spectator, and like film, it takes time. To fully see the emerging form, it is necessary to move around and through it, to look at it from the inside and from the outside. Andy Warhol's Empire, by contrast, requires a patient, frontally oriented spectator willing to engage with the 8-hour-long stationary shot of the Empire State Building, which was filmed by none other than Jonas Mekas from the 44th floor of the Time Life Building on the eve of July 25th, 1964. The only interruption in the unfolding temporality and obstinate fixity of this grainy, static, hieratic portrait of the skyscraper is a flash of light that signals a change in the film reel. And while Empire's resolute frontality and image quality indelibly mark it as a film, it is also fairly unwatchable as a film. Still, extracted from the context of the cityscape around it, the structure obtains an unyielding grandeur as time passes until the screen fades to black. That is arguably monumental, if not sculptural. I think I have a fan in the back of the room, a very small one. Other artists working at the interface between sculpture and film during this period include Robert Whitman, whose Shower, also from 1964, incorporated a Super 8 film of a woman bathing on a continuous loop, projected onto the curtain hanging before a working shower. Whitman's Shower is considered to be a precursor for the artistic hijacking of film away from the dual apparatus, projector and screen, and towards its incorporation into more elaborate forms of sculptural installation that would flourish later, such as these kooky sculptural projections by Tony Orsler. A final example of the mobilization of film in the construction of 3D environments is Yoko Ono's Sky TV, which transformed an ordinary television monitor into a sculptural transmitter of the exterior world. Working with nascent surveillance camera technologies, Ono subverted the use and function of the commercial TV set by fixing the gallery viewer's gaze simultaneously on the object and on the sky above. Film also served the crucial purpose of documentation of sculpture, as in Robert Smithson's rundown of his entropic poured pieces in 1969, or his vocal pacing of the coordinates and materials of Spiral Jetty from a Helicopter in 1970. And I should say that there's something very artificial about this because we're not actually watching the film, so we can't tell what's happening in terms of movement and time and the address to the spectator. But most of these films are available on Über or Vimeo or even YouTube. And Robert Smithson's website has excerpts from both the film of Spiral Jetty and from Rundown. So I encourage you to look at them. The film of him reciting the coordinates of Spiral Jetty is absolutely extraordinary, with the sound of the helicopter whooshing above. Sculptor Richard Serra also employed film, most notably in the short Hand-Catching Lead, which features the artist's hand repeatedly trying to grasp pieces of metal dropped into the frame. It plays on the invisible sequence of a film's 24 frames per second, and the title, Hand-Catching Lead, refers as well to the leader or to the bit of film that one threads into the projector. Made in the same year, he was splashing ladlefuls of molten lead around Leo Castelli's gallery space so they would solidify into cast corner pieces. The two physical gestures work both with and against each other as remnants of the artist's sculptural process. I'm not claiming that Serra's film and his splashed sculptures are media equivalents, but suggesting that their juxtaposition, much like the juxtaposition in film montage or sculptural assemblage, can engender new meanings that might not become apparent from viewing the single elements on their own, or at least can produce something like a more thorough contextual understanding of the artist's rhythms, movements, and the nature of her and his materials. They act as supplements to each other that ultimately contribute to our understanding of his sculpture. And there is Serra splashing lead and Vaseline in his reenactment for Matthew Barney's Cremaster 3. In Jonathan Wally's article, The Material of Film and the Idea of Cinema, Contrasting Practices in 60s and 70s Avant-Garde Film, which has served as an important guide for this paper, Wally follows on structural film pioneer Hollis Frampton and offers up the term paracinematic, para meaning beside, near, alongside, or beyond, as a compromise between rigid notions of medium specificity and two pluralistic understandings of the definition of film. For Frampton, any phenomenon is paracinematic if it shares one element with cinema, for example, modularity with respect to space and time. Under this paradigm, the absence of the three-dimensional sculptural object or environment, therefore, does not forestall the interpretation and experience of something as sculptural. One could perhaps develop an analysis of the codependency of sculpture and film in Matthew Barney's practice, or try to better describe the confrontational relationship between the outdated projector and typewriter in Rodney Graham's Rheinmetall Victoria, according to notions of the paracinematic and the parasculptural. But that's not really going to be possible for me to do today. At any rate, the exploration of the interface between film and sculpture shows no sign of abating. Lily de Warrenneau's Black Maria, the title of which references Thomas Edison's movie production studio, incorporates live performance, sculptural props, and installations, while Gabrielle Lester's Future Chasing the Past, Chasing the Present uses the deceptively simple conceit of a conveyor belt topped with a miniature landscape to create a cinematic shadow play on the walls surrounding his sculpture. Rosa Barba turns the traditional apparatus of projector film and light into a hanging sculpture, and on a much larger scale, she's transformed the architecture of the Aldo Rossi-designed art center in Vassivia, France, into a giant projector, the beam of light visible only at night, extending far into the darkness of the sculpture park surrounding the building, with no flat surface to catch it. When Diamantis Narkevitsius failed in his attempt to procure the monumental sculpture of Karl Marx's head from its site in Chemnitz, Germany, and have it moved to Münster for the Sculpture Project exhibition in 2007, he decided to make a film instead, out of found footage, as a replacement, because he believed that he could, in film, express the aesthetics that sculpture embodies. Joseph Beuys once said, "For me, the formation of the thought is already a sculpture." What the admittedly schematic picture I've drawn illustrates, I hope, is that it no longer follows that an artist who is seeking to locate the essence of sculpture has to do so by reducing her or his practice to the materials and physical characteristics traditionally defined as sculptural. The essence of sculpture might indeed be something quite more intangible. It might be hidden in the overwrought histories or the long-forgotten sculptural experiments. It might have to do with light and time, or with sight, or with the public. We might never actually know what it is. But it's quite likely that the medium of sculpture is only one of the many possible forms of the art of sculpture. And I don't think that's such a bad thing. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Vivian Rehberg. Sollen wir Fragen dazwischen machen? Möglichkeit. Mikrofon.
Jörg Heiser has a question.
Yes. I was thinking that this idea that you presented, that ultimately, or that's how I understood it, or that's the question maybe also, does it in some way mean that, maybe that's true for all mediums, that we understand the medium only from the perspective of another? Like
being in a chain.
Looking at sculpture from the perspective of cinema, we suddenly see sculpture, or its essence in a way, and then vice versa, as I think the Anthony McCall piece makes very clear, the cone, the line describing a cone, that works both ways then, that in some way suddenly sculptural attitudes, you could say, transform cinema.
Yes.
But I think that's what I mean. Do you think there has to be a starting point from one of the media? Do you think that someone has to be steeped inside a medium, so to speak, to be able to make that transition?
I hope not. I'm not an artist, so I don't feel like I can really respond to that with any kind of authority, but I would hope not. I mean, I would hope that a familiarity with watching cinema would perhaps be enough to enable a young artist to start working with cinema as a medium. Also, the exhibition environment is one in which you're assailed with so many different media, and I think that because it's the privileged place where we see artistic production today, it's impossible to get any vision of a pure art object in a kind of pure context. I mean, it just simply doesn't exist. And I don't want to use the term chain of signifiers because I don't think that that's actually what's going on. But there is a, yes, I think it's relational. I think that the way in which media functions today is necessarily relational and probably did so art historically as well, but the art historical narratives don't necessarily allow for that. Jan Vervoort has a question.
No, as a follow-up question to Jörg's question, it seemed that in the second part of the talk you were really suggesting that maybe the best way to understand sculpture would be through cinema, or as Jörg said, vice versa, that if we want to understand what cinema is, we should make a sculpture about it. So that maybe the whole assumption that we could define a medium in and through itself is kind of warped. Well, that seemed to be an implication of the second part of your talk, but in your discussion of Rosalind Krauss, you also seem to work towards a more expanded, no, I shouldn't say expanded, a different sense of returning to the medium, or Krauss's intriguing definition of a medium as something that allows you to project and remember.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether you could also talk a little bit about that. What is your opinion on about Krauss's redefinition of the medium? Do you see any value in that?
It's a sort of classically avant-gardist position, because what she's claiming, for example, with works by William Kentridge and James Coleman, is that the photographic and filmic processes became obsolete. And these are artists who, in the face of the obsolescence, in a very sort of Walter Benjaminian move, can try to recuperate something redemptive in the medium. So it's something that's absolutely structural to the kind of medium, whether it's a slide projector with little square slide pictures, or in animation. She really does want there to be something inside the medium itself that will enable art to remain serious, and in that sense, I think she remains also, she's trying to say also politically effective. I don't necessarily take that on board. I find it's an attractive argument. It's also very romantic, and I like that. What I think is important for me, and the way that I like to think of things, and especially in terms of the relationship between specific objects, and especially with respect to the ways in which artists are continually going back into art history, is that we need to pay attention to the specificity of the historical characteristic or moment in which particular media have been produced and are interacting. And that involves a kind of attention to the general that Rosalind Krauss wouldn't abide by at all, because she wants us to focus on the specific. Does that answer your question a little bit?
And the general would be the historical momentum, the historical context, the moment in time when a certain medium came into existence.
The general would be, say in the context of an artist working in a mixed media confronting film and sculpture in the 1960s, would be all of the discourses, all of the social and political and cultural formations that would have enabled sculpture to become sculpture, and then equally all of the everything that enabled film to become film. So in that sense, you have to have a general kind of knowledge, right? A general kind of a broader outlook on what's happening in society as a whole, in order to be able to say something about the historical specificity of why a media becomes what it does, or why a medium becomes what it does. And I think Jennifer's going to address this as well with the move to digital media, and the way in which that, in some ways, opens out our possibility for knowledge, but also creates an incredible anxiety because we can't possibly know everything. My fan club in the back has a question. This is...
Hello. Thank you. You described a lot of an expanded sculpture, but what I wonder is, you showed us, especially in the second part of your talk, a lot of installations. I mean, a lot of the artists would rather prefer to have their pieces called installations, like video installation or Rosa Bava film installation. And it's a term which is also came into being in the 60s. Rather, it followed environment. And so I wonder what kind of distinction you have, because it's something like a parallel development.
You're absolutely right. It is a parallel development, and I deliberately didn't speak about installation and environment because it problematizes things with respect to the public and so forth that I'm just not capable to get into in 30 minutes. On the other hand, the works that I've chosen are works actually that the artists have specifically described as being sculpture in print. So I have tried to be slightly faithful to that, and not focus too much on works that were installations.
But if we talk about expanded about sculpture as an expanded term, isn't it rather an installation?
Sculpture certainly gets expanded into installation, yes.
Mm-hmm.
We've been talking about how, or you've presented the way cinema and sculpture, to put it very simply, sort of started to interact, both with the notion of expanded cinema and the notion of sculpture in the expanded field, sort of, again, parallel developments that kind of at some point overlapped. And I was wondering, is there maybe at the same time something involved what could be called alienation from other mediums as well? Because we're talking about all these kind of fusions or overlaps of different media, but thinking especially about Rosalind Krauss, I was thinking maybe she also really had an alienation from the medium of painting. Because this was a time when people like Michael Fried, to put it very bluntly, had kind of cornered the market on talking about painting in the magazines like Artforum and so on in the late 60s, where there was this kind of like strong kind of competition amongst artists and critics alike to define certain media. So in some way, ironically, I think, and now my question is, would you agree that Krauss, in order to be able to talk about a medium expanding, had to retreat from another?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very much related as well to her trying to sort of get the monkey of Clement Greenberg off her back, you know, and the attempt to carve out a position for herself as a female critic in New York in the 1960s, late 1960s and early 70s. But she does write about painting. I mean, her areas of focus are really photography and sculpture, and now the question of medium specificity and what she would never call an installation, for example, would be Marcel Brotard's Musée d'Art Moderne. I mean, Rosalind Krauss despises installation. It's the thing she hates most in the world. So yes, I mean, identifying a field in which she can, delimiting her own field in which she can act and hopefully impact the trajectory in which certain artists were working. It's a very American story as well. I mean, obviously my story leaves out an incredible amount of information about what was going on in the rest of the world. So. Thank you.